Hello, and today I'm going to be talking about reading because reading is not just one skill, it's a whole system working together in synchrony. We might try to simplify the way that we teach reading, but it's actually made up of interconnected processes that our policies don't even necessarily reflect. For many people, reading is a gateway. It grants access to information and the understanding of that information. Reading is not only a matter of unlocking the text on the page, it actually has a far more lasting effect on language development and educational attainment and employability. A recent meta-analysis of the neurobiology of reading has revealed new insights into the intricacies of reading behaviour using brain imaging techniques. The team from the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognition and Brain Sciences, led by Supriya Turka, analysed findings from 163 experiments involving 3,031 adults. None of these studies included participants with specific learning difficulties such as dyslexia, and so these findings represent reading processes in people who are considered to have normal or typical reading development. The meta-analysis included studies of the alphabetic reading processes in 10 different languages, and whole brain imaging was used. Now, the team examined the sub-processes of reading. That means reading letters, words, pseudowords, sentences, and extended text. And for decades, educational debates have reduced reading to a handful of competencies such as phonics, decoding, and comprehension. And of course, each of these has been positioned as the most important element, the one lever that supposedly moves everything else. But the latest neuroscientific evidence from this meta-analysis challenges the tendency that we have to simplify at a fundamental level the way that we read, because reading is not a single skill or a single process. It's a distributed, dynamic, multi-network activity that recruits the brain far more widely than our curricula or our assessments assume. So educational policy tends to talk about reading as a unitary skill. We talk about the ability to read, and we can think about some of the most enduring models of reading. One that stands out for me is the simple view of reading by Goff and Tumner, which has really stood the test of time because it includes absolutely fundamental aspects of reading, such as language processing, decoding skills, and reading comprehension. And these are its three key components. But the actual complexity of reading tells a more interesting story of human experience. Reading activates classical left hemisphere language areas. It also activates bilateral visual systems and auditory and phonological regions. And there are then the frontoparietal executive networks, and we mustn't forget the subcortical structures, including the cerebellum. The classical reading areas are located in the language regions of the left hemisphere of the brain. This view of reading suggests that specific reading operations of single word recognition, phonological processes, and semantic processes are distinctive. The meta-analysis confirmed the importance of these left hemisphere language areas in reading. Other brain areas were also activated and pointed to links between the visual word form area and the dorsal attention network, also known as DAN. The DAN is associated with spatial attention and orienting. It's very easy to overlook the visual orienting of the eyes as they alight on individual words or glide across a line of connected text. But these movements demand focused attention and coordination between the tasks of sustaining attention, controlling eye gaze, and also visually processing the words. When we pick up a text and decide to read it, we are engaging in a goal-oriented activity. This is whether to satisfy our curiosity or perhaps to solve some kind of problem or just to really enjoy a book that we've got into. Our executive functions support goal-directed behaviour, and they help us through inhibitory control to narrow our focus onto the reading task. Other executive functions such as task switching support our capacity to respond in the moment and to pivot with changes in syntactic content in particular. Working memory is perhaps the most obvious of the three core executive functions, and this represents the capacity for holding and managing context and content. This is what phenomenologists refer to as the given and the new in the sequence. The auditory areas are of course involved because we are processing sound when we process language. But the intriguing part of this is how we allocate our resources to different units of sound. And related to this, we need to include the cerebellum, also known as the little brain. And it's so called because it's involved as a regulator of tasks and is implicated in timing processes. This broad distribution of processes explains something that educators witness every day. Some children can decode accurately, but they can't really comprehend. Others have strong comprehension, but weak fluency. Others read aloud confidently, but they falter in silent reading tasks. The brain is not activating one skill, but a constellation of interconnected processes, each with distinct demands. The meta-analysis showed that all of the studies and all of the sub-processes of reading activated language regions, precentral motor and auditory regions of the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere regions involved in emotional processing, as well as consistent activation of bilateral areas of the cerebellum associated with subcortical processes involving timing and regulation. The authors described this as a bilaterally spread network. There were also differences between the tasks, with certain tasks having high specificity for particular brain areas, and the authors proposed these formed a hierarchy. Letters, words, pseudowords, sentences, and text formed the different steps of the hierarchy. And it's interesting that there were big contrasts between these activation areas. So for letter reading, this was a very specific area indeed, with only a tiny part of the brain activated. In my opinion, reading an individual symbol such as a letter, which has no intrinsic meaning of its own, would not have a biological basis. So for me, this is very much a task that is simply a social construct. Word reading, on the other hand, involved a large area of the left hemisphere and showed a distributed pattern of activation. For me, this is unsurprising because reading words engages orthographic shape recognition and lexical semantic regions of the left hemisphere, forming familiar and efficient route for recognizing the known words. Word reading, in my opinion, naturally bootstraps onto word processing areas that have been evolving over millions of years. Pseudo-word reading was expected to form a more distinctive outcome, but the authors commented that there was a close similarity between reading words and reading non-words, and that this was probably due to the participants being adults, and it was likely that they processed the non-words as syllables. Typically, reading non-words requires more effortful phonological assembly and relies on dorsal regions associated with phonological decoding. And perhaps if these studies had involved children, we would have seen much more of that represented. Sentence reading, again, bootstraps onto the natural processing of phrases and sentences across a wide area of activation. And this showed that sentence processing takes place in distributed networks. The activation pattern for reading extended text was very specific indeed, located in a very small area. This did not translate easily into a speech processing pattern. And for me, this suggests that the evolutionary underpinnings of reading extended text are actually not well developed. And this may explain why the activation pattern is so specific. So to take all of this together, what we can see is that there is indeed a hierarchy of reading tasks, and that it is associated with language processes of the left hemisphere, and that at word and sentence levels, these are distributed networks. Different tasks produce different activations, and no doubt these layers are exquisitely complex. So if as reading is a network process, then our literacy strategies must also reflect that. The challenge for us really is to design systems that nurture every part of that network, from decoding to comprehension, and from attention to executive function. These findings show clearly that reading is not just one skill, but a whole brain endeavour. And the question is, to what extent are our systems reflecting this? I'll leave the link to the full paper in the description below, and thank you so much for joining me today in this post.